Hey guys, we are in our LT2 section of the muscle unit. So this is all about the histology of the muscular system. And I know that our schedule recently has been kind of crazy. We've had a snow day, and then we've had the whole district is off, and then we've had a weekend. And so we're off our normal, right? Which it's 2020, 2021. So maybe that's just how it goes. But I wanted to start this actually by just making sure that I've been clear on what you should have done up to this point. Before you see any new lecture, what should you have done right now? And so depending on whether you're an A or a B day student, you might have been in class, you might have received the LT2 notes packet, or maybe not. And so posted on the calendar directly is a link to this LT2 notes packet. And I went ahead and uploaded it to the muscle unit section of Google Classroom. So you can access it there as well. So if you didn't get the packet in class, you would either need to make a copy in your Google Drive and fill out the notes electronically, or you would need to print this notes packet. Now, the first section of the notes packet was actually something that is done on your own using a section out of the textbook. Now, some of you were in class to be able to access the textbook directly, but others were not. Whether you were on quarantine or you're a B-day student, some of you did not have access to the textbook to fill out the first section of your notes. So I took a picture of the 2 or 3 pages in the textbook that corresponded and uploaded those to both the calendar and to the muscle unit section on Google Classroom. So as we kind of look at the first section, I'm not going over this. This came out of the text that I uploaded, or the text that you accessed in your textbook in class. But the first section of LT2 talks about the 3 different types of muscle tissue. So you read and you took notes over cardiac, skeletal, and smooth muscle tissue. The second section of your LT2 notes came again from the textbook content. This detailed the specific functions of muscle. And so there were 4, maybe 5, I think it was 4 functions listed in the textbook, and you wrote those down in this section of your notes. And then the third section of your notes came from the textbook as well. These were 4 unique properties of muscles, and you can see them right here. It's listed in your notes. These words are listed in your notes. You read about each one, and you wrote a few things down about them. Those first 3 Roman numerals in your LT2 notes packet should be done by the time you come sit down and watch the lecture. So what we're starting now would be the next section in your notes packet. So this is Roman numeral 4, and this is the structure of a muscle. And so I have this diagram over here. It's the same diagram that's in your notes packet. By the end of writing down some of this content, you should have also made sure that you have labeled the key components. So I left this labeling diagram up here so that you know exactly what to label. And here are, so you're going to label the diagram, but then you're also going to take some notes as we talk about these structures. So if we look at, when I talk about a muscle, I'm talking about what is called the muscle organ, the big muscle. Those are the muscles that we learned the names of back in LT1. And so the muscle is surrounded by a connective tissue. And then compartments within the muscle that you can see here in the diagram are also surrounded by connective tissue. So your first bullet indicates that multiple levels of connective tissue exist that we're getting ready to talk about related to this muscle. The first level of connective tissue is called the epimysium. And the epimysium surrounds the outermost large muscle organ. So this kind of clear sheet right here is the epimysium. You should label that on your diagram, as well as writing down the actual notes that are kind of popping up on the screen. So this is the epimysium. Now, if we work our way deeper, we find the paramysium. The paramysium surrounds this bundle called a fascicle. So a fascicle, that's new language, and that is something that you should label in your diagram, as well as labeling the paramycium in your diagram. A fascicle is just a bundle of these even smaller structures called muscle fibers. So we're 2 levels deep, and we've talked about 2 types of connective tissue, the epimycium and the paramycium. The final layer of connective tissue surrounds this tiny little segment right here called the muscle fiber or the muscle cell. And that is the endomycium. Endo means inner. So this is the innermost connective tissue lining a structure in the muscle. So it surrounds what is called the muscle fiber, which we'll see in just a second. It's just a fancier name for a muscle cell. So you have, if I go deep to superficial, deep is a muscle fiber or a muscle cell that is surrounded by a connective tissue called the endomycium. Now, a bunch of muscle fibers create this structure right here, which is called a fascicle. And the fascicle is surrounded by a connective tissue called the paramycium. Now, there are multiple fascicles bundled into an entire muscle organ. And so if you put a whole bunch of these fascicles together and then surround that in the epimycium, you get what we refer to as a skeletal muscle, the muscles that we learned in LT1. Now, you can also see that there are some little blue and red tubes right here. These are blood vessels, an artery, and a vein. And so keep in mind, muscles are living tissue. And so those cells need access to blood, to nutrients that are going to be delivered to and recycled from the tissue by way of the circulatory system. So you have to have some blood vessels in there. The last thing that I would say here on this section of our notes is that actually all 3 of these levels of connective tissue, they pull back and kind of converge and create the tendon. And the tendon is a structure that holds a muscle to the bone. And so when the muscle contracts, it pulls on the tendon, which then pulls on the bone and produces the overall function of movement of our bodies. The next section of our notes dives deeper into where we left off. So let me go back here. We talked about the big muscle, we talked about the fascicles, and then we talked about the muscle cell. So the next section of our notes dives even deeper into this muscle fiber or muscle cell. So what we see here, this structure, this larger structure, is the smallest structure on the previous diagram. So there's actually even more going on inside the muscle cell. So here are a bunch of kind of new vocab words. I've tried to put the vocab words that need to be labeled on the diagram in red so that you can see them as they pop up, and then you can reference the diagram and label it correctly. Label the diagram in your notes correctly. So let's start with this entire muscle fiber is surrounded by a membrane, and that membrane is called the sarcolemma. And that membrane sits just underneath the endomycium. So think about the previous diagram that we saw. The smallest structure on that previous diagram was the muscle fiber, and it was surrounded in a connective tissue called the endomycium. Well, just below the endomycium is that muscle fiber's membrane. And instead of calling it a cell membrane, we give it a special name. We call it a sarcolemma, but it is, in fact, just a membrane surrounding the muscle cell. So sarcolemma is a new vocab word for us here. Make sure you've labeled it on your diagram. Now, you'll notice that the sarcolemma occasionally plunges into the innermost part of the muscle cell, and it creates what is shown in your diagram on the screen, at least, this little yellow network of tubes. And these are called T-tubules. But it's important to remember that T-tubules are just an extension of the sarcolemma. So this layer right here is our sarcolemma, and occasionally that punches down into and pushes deep into the muscle fiber or the muscle cell. Now, T-tubules are important because they're going to store calcium, and they're going to conduct an electrical impulse, which is going to be really important for causing the muscle to actually contract. Notice this overall muscle cell is made up of even more of these sort of inner compartments. So the cell is made up of a bunch of myofibrils. So here's one myofibril that's been pulled out, but here's another one and another one and another myofibril and another myofibril and another myofibril. And so as a characteristic, we could say that a collection of myofibrils pull together to make the muscle fiber, which then if we put that into perspective on the previous diagram, the muscle fiber pulls back in a collection, pulls back to create a fascicle, and multiple fascicles bundled together create the muscle organ. Now, the thing that is sort of important for future understanding of muscle contraction is that these myofibrils are actually made of something even smaller. The smaller things are called myofilaments, and there are two kinds of myofilaments. There are thick filaments and there are thin filaments. And so in the diagram, the thick filaments look kind of purple and the thins look red. Once we kind of zoom into and blow up the structure of a myofibril, you'll see and understand why the thick are called thick and the thin are called thin, although in this diagram, they kind of look the same size. So just pay attention to what you're labeling, that you really do label the thick ones as what we see here with this line going through them and then these horizontal lines coming out. And then the red in my diagram, which are the thin filaments, are attached to this thing that looks like a zigzag right down here. So pay attention to your diagram that you label the thick and the thin appropriately. Collectively, they are both referred to as myofilaments, and they make up a myofibril, which makes up a muscle cell, which makes up a fascicle, which makes up a muscle. I know I just keep repeating it, but it's good to kind of get that in our head. Each myofibril, so each one of these little things, we've got one pulled out right here, each myofibril is surrounded by this sort of interesting network, which in this model appears sort of blue. It's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So if you look at not the one that's pulled out, but some of the ones that are still tucked back in here, each one of these myofibrils is surrounded in this blue meshy looking matrix. So that is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. If you hear reticulum, maybe that makes you think of some other reticulum that we have seen in cells before, maybe back in biology. It's in the family of smooth ER and rough ER. You remember hearing about those? That smooth endoplasmic reticulum and rough endoplasmic reticulum. Well, this is another reticulum that is specific to a muscle cell. Now, reticulums typically make or hold things. And so here we find the storage place of calcium, which calcium is going to be essential in making that muscle, the actual muscle cell, contract. And so we have built into our muscle cell this storage unit called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Last bullet here under the SR is just to remind you that it's part of the family of other reticula that we have learned about in science, in biological sciences, hopefully in high school before. And the last thing to point out in this diagram are these little purple mitochondria. So make sure that you label these purple mitochondria. Muscle cells have a lot of mitochondria compared to other cell types. So think about, what does mitochondria do? Some of you just in your head said, it's the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, really, mitochondria are producing ATP in the, oh, my puppy is yelping. Oh, okay. Mitochondria is producing ATP in the process of cellular respiration. ATP is cellular energy. And so any cell that has a bunch of mitochondria is probably going to need a bunch of energy. And so you think back to muscle cells contract so that all of those functions that you saw in Roman numeral 2 of your notes can actually occur. And that's why we see a whole bunch of mitochondria here to supply the energy demands of, in this case in particular, skeletal muscle. Okay, so at this point, you're done with the next section of notes that I want you to take. And if you are an A-day student, I need for you to be advocates for yourself. If there's a sub, if you are in person today, there's a sub. And so I need for you to find this diagram that is up on the front table, and I need for you to start coloring it. So you'll use the key over here to color the various components that we just talked about. And there's a couple of questions down here that you'll answer as well. If you are a B-day student, you will pick up this diagram on Tuesday when you come to class. I will hand it to you. So A-day students, you wrap up your day today. Having taken the notes, you're going to find this diagram on the front table, and you're going to grab one and you're going to start coloring. If you don't have coloring pencils with you, over on my side bench top, there is a stackable system of drawers, and there should be colored pencils over there. If you're a B-day student, again, you'll get this on Tuesday, and you'll do it as a part of another day's assignment this week. Okay, I am done. You are done. Happy Monday to everyone. Let me know if you need anything in the meantime.